Good morning and welcome to the Door County Reads 2022 Festival. My name is Tina Kukuski and I'm the director of the Door County Library. Today's event is Things Like Hope and Faith, the Optimism of Michael Perry. Before we begin, there's a little housekeeping to do. This program may touch on varying points of view, and we thank you for being open to hearing others' opinions and participating in intellectual freedom in a respectful manner. And you can find us at #DoorCountyReads. And now I would like to introduce our pragmatic moderator, Rebecca Meacham. Rebecca is the professor of English, Humanities, and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, the chair of the BFA in Writing and Applied Arts program, director of the teaching press at UW Green Bay, and the advisor for Sheepshead Review. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you, Tina, and thank you, those of you in attendance and our wonderful panelists for joining us on a Saturday morning of Super Bowl weekend. It's really great to have your attention and to bring you the great thoughts of these colleagues of mine. So I'm very excited to talk about Michael Perry today. And thanks to Door County Reads for doing such a great program and for letting us chime in. So when I was thinking about Michael Perry, I have a little experience as a book festival planner and Michael Perry when years ago when Green Bay, the city, had a book festival that was annual, the very first iteration of these, very first panel, our very first festival we ever wanted to have, our very first on the stage writer representing all the greatness of Wisconsin was Michael Perry, and it seemed like an obvious choice. So I wanted to have us talk a bit about the appeal of Michael Perry and why Michael Perry continues to appeal to readers, given so much of the dark subject matter that he deals with in his stories and his chronicles and his columns and his songs and all the things that he does. So the idea for this panel was Michael Perry writes to wallow in cynicism and to dismiss things like hope and faith is cowardly and unoriginal. And so when I thought about this, his stories chronicling struggles in life and love in rural Wisconsin, I felt all the way through a kind of optimism, even though he's written that he's not an optimist. So it's interesting to me. These stories make us feel good. And so, of course, I wondered, well, how is that possible? As a writer myself and as a person who studies writing as well. So I turned to the people who I think can talk to us about this the best. So what we're going to do first is I'm going to have the panelists go around and introduce themselves in the context of this panel. I turned to a psychologist, a humorist, a scholar of literature, a dramatist, an idealist. I think I've got everyone, do I? I feel like it's a long list. And then myself as a pragmatist to figure out, why do Michael Perry's stories make us feel good? So first, I will lead off with his introduction, the psychologist, Dr. Ryan Martin. Can you tell us a little bit about who you are?
I can. Thank you so much for having me and for having all of us. My name is Ryan Martin. I'm a psychologist here at UW Green Bay. And I study emotions, usually anger, but also I teach a course on emotions. So I study joy, sadness, guilt, jealousy, fear, the works. And the other thing, and I don't actually know if Rebecca knew this when she asked me to be on the panel, but early on in my career, I actually wrote a little bit about and studied how we can use humor in therapy. And so the role that humor plays in mental health is something that is near and dear to my heart.
Oh, wonderful. I didn't know that. That's excellent. All right. Next up is our humorist, Jenny Young. Will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me today. So I teach English and writing courses at UWGB, and I've always enjoyed reading humor, specifically sort of situational, observational humor, but also satire. I started out the pandemic living alone in a studio apartment, which was pretty depressing and not funny. And as a way of dealing with that, I started taking satire writing classes through the Second City Improv House in Chicago, virtually, obviously. Since then, I've had a number of pieces in multiple humor publications, McSweeney's probably being the best known. So that's where I'm coming from.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jenny. Along those lines, I'm going to turn to another colleague of mine in English, Ann Mattis, who was chosen not just because she's a genius, but because she's done a course on literature, humorous literature, and has studied this before. So Ann, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I can. So I am a scholar of American literature and culture, a teacher of American literature and culture. And I also started teaching a lot of feminist cultural studies classes. And I just became very interested in really more the political implications of comedy. And I started to see all these feminist comedians kind of like showing up at the DNC and, you know, playing a prominent role in really the dominant, you know, political scene. And I was intrigued by that and how really it seems to be in the back pockets of the politicians that, you know, comedy does play a role in, you know, changing people's minds and that sort of thing. So really, I was kind of interested in the political efficacy of comedy.
Awesome. That sounds great. Now with a flourish, I'm going to introduce, sorry guys, our dramatist. I tried, I need a scarf. So Noah Simon, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, but I'll be doing this the whole time. My name is Noah Simon. I'm a theater artist and I teach theater classes at St. Norbert College. And I'm really excited to be a part of this panel because I'm actually really excited to be introduced to Michael Perry's work. And as far as where I'm coming from to be on this panel, my background is that I spent the majority of my career as an actor and theater maker in Chicago in the storefront community. And one particular company that I worked with that I was part of called Factory Theater Company, it was entirely devoted to the art form of satire. All scripts were original, world premieres, and were satirical looks at the world around us, which is one of the things I liked so much about Michael Perry, is that what I find his work to be at once heartwarming, but also comedically edgy, you know, because he calls himself, or he talks about optimism, even though he may not be an optimist, but he also, you can feel the love for place emanating from his work. And aside from satire, and then I have a background in improv, thank you, Second City. I'm also, as a theater artist, super interested in community engaged theater. So art is already a reflection of the world around us, but community engaged theater is bringing the public into the process. So anyway, blah, blah, blah. I could go on forever. Anyway, that's me. That's me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, and we'll have you go on forever in just a minute.
Okay,
all right, so rounding out our panel, straight from my downstairs of my house right now is Chuck Ryback, who comes at this, I've labeled him the idealist. And so, and maybe we'll talk about what even that means, but in the context of Michael Perry and so forth. But Chuck, can you introduce yourself to the good people?
Sure, just briefly, thanks for having me. I'm Chuck Ryback. I'm a English professor. American Lit was really my emphasis, and creative writer, very run-of-the-mill creative writer, I would say. I also work in administration right now at UW Green Bay. I guess, I don't know why I'm here. I guess I'm an idealist, which means that I'm eternally sad in the present, but hopeful about the future. And I have read Michael Perry in the past, and yeah, so I'm just happy to be here. Thanks.
That was a really good description of exactly how I would describe your idealism. So that was really well put. Thank you for doing that. And I guess I'm the pragmatist, which is like, well, what should we do with the present? Let's make a chart and figure it out. So here's my chart right here in my Zoom screen. So what I wanted to start us with, Noah already kind of got me thinking about this, and maybe all of us thinking, and this is a question kind of for everyone. So whoever would like to chime in first, and then we'll just follow suit. What are the pleasures of Michael Perry's writing or stories? I think they're on many levels, and I know I have a way of answering this, and I'll quickly give my answer to help you. And that is that, I like the way that his words, the way he uses the line level crafting of the way he's working through idioms and people's speech and like direct dialogue and stuff. But I also like the way he's structuring the pieces and going back and forth, especially in Population 485, I should say, between really hard stuff and he just sort of organizing things in this interesting way. That's a very vague way of offering praise. Who would like to speak more about the pleasures of Michael Perry's work? Who would like to go first on this one? Or I'm just going to call on you.
I'll go.
Okay.
Go
ahead. You go ahead.
Anne, go ahead.
Okay, I'll go ahead. So I guess what came to mind first for me was I'm new to Michael Perry, and what I appreciated reading this was I'm not feeling very hopeful about rural populism right now. I'm not feeling I've flattened. I live in Milwaukee, okay? And even though my mom was raised in rural Wisconsin and I grew up going, to small town Wisconsin, I felt a very strong divide between urban and rural life right now in this state context, politically speaking, for clearly obvious reasons, right? And I kind of felt like better about that. I felt it was endearing to me to kind of go back to how I think I felt when I moved to Milwaukee 10 years ago. I was excited about Wisconsin and its quirkiness and its idiosyncraticness. And I felt more as a, radical left academic, less that way here. After everything that happened with Scott Walker and all that, we know about that. So no reason to go there, but I guess it kind of got me to a softer appreciation and less hostile, I guess. And that's flattening and problematic and elitist and all those things. But I think that's where I was. And if I'm really honest with myself. So that's the pleasure. I don't know. Is that too confessional? I feel like it was, but being recorded. But that's the pleasure for me, is feeling less hostile.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, I there's actually some things I want to talk about in terms of how you had kind of posted a question about political divisions, and when we were working this out, and it made me wonder about like how Perry works with conflict. So I want us to talk about that a little bit later, but that makes sense to me. And probably I saw a lot of people nodding on the screen, like, yeah, I there's something in there that's making me realize maybe other pleasures like commonality or community or just humor that can arise in these places that we have these barriers and borders up. Our hackles are up, so this relaxes those a little bit. I love the way you put that. Let me turn to Noah, because he was like ready on this one. So let me go to Noah next.
So there are a few. I'm really grateful that Michael Perry just came into my life, because for a couple of reasons. Number one, he reminds me a lot of one of my favorite authors, Tom Robbins. Who, if you don't know Tom Robbins, Still Life with Woodpecker, Skinny Legs and All. He has a similar kind of biting, satirical, takes you on an adventure like you're sitting on his shoulder kind of writing. And I have good feelings about Michael just from that perspective. But as a theater artist, from Population 485, 489.
485.
45.
5.
Population 45. Sorry, Michael. Especially because I was thinking about this panel and you know, one of the very first line, if I may, from this book is, "Summer here comes on like a Zoptic hippie chick jazzed on chlorophyll and flinging fistfuls of butterflies to the sun."
That's a great line.
Okay, so when we create theater, our lifeblood is description, detail, specificity. And Michael writes in a way that if I wanted, so he already did it, I don't need to do it, but if I was going to adapt this into a play, or frankly any book, what I want is something that is so chock full. It's like an embarrassment of riches in terms of his ability to describe these real life circumstances. The other, and finally, the last thing I want to say in terms of why this is such a pleasure is I have a sweet spot in my heart for Spoon River Anthology and Our Town, for small town life. I don't know how that happened. I imagine I grew up in smaller towns until I spent my adult life in Chicago. And I have a nostalgic attachment to that idea of small town life. And just, sorry, the last thing I'll say, because I don't really want to go on and on, is that my wife and I moved here from Chicago 4 years ago. And in Chicago, we were ensconced in our own little liberal bubble where we didn't hear alternate or different views on the political landscape, on the civil, on the community landscape. It was all very much homogenous in terms of how people felt about the world around them. And then we moved to Green Bay, which I love. I love this town. But it was a little culture shock at first, because there are many people outside of our educational life that don't share our worldview. And so finally, the thing I like about Michael is that he has lived 20 different lives. If you listen to him talk, and I watched his virtual keynote speech. He talks about there are all these other jobs that he has held, including most notably as a volunteer firefighter. And one of the things I've tried to do since I've been here, especially as a community engaged theater artist, is to get out there and have conversations with people who don't see the world the way I do. Mm-hmm. And so the point is that there's a humility in his work as he describes in loving detail his hometown, but it's not rosy. It's like, this place is run down and I love it. And I'll let you guys decide how those things go together. It was very clear in my brain. So anyway, Rebecca, let me hand it back to you.
That was great though. I love the fact that you read that first line, and I have some things I want to talk about with that too. But also the fact that I love the fact that you brought up his multiple, he contains multitudes, right? That he's done so many different things. If you were able to watch those on screen, those on the panel, his keynote, it was a series of pictures, and some of them he's in Panama, and it's like he's in Wyoming, and he's writing about Wisconsin from these remarkable vantage points. And Noah, what I took about what you're saying is that all of us could have those kinds of complexities too, that when we see each other surface wise, or we assume we're in our bubble or whatever, that we just don't ascribe to other people. So that's one of the things I also think is key to take away from him as well. So I'm going to hand it over to Jenny. What are the pleasures of Michael Perry's work?
I think part of what I appreciate about reading his work, and I'm fairly new to Michael Perry, is how well he understands Wisconsin. So I moved here almost 5 years ago. I'd been here exactly once for a job interview in February, and it was 50 degrees, which I feel like was a little bit of false advertising. But So I came here, I was raised in Cleveland, Ohio, and I thought, well, it's another struggling Rust Belt city. It'll pretty much be exactly the same, but, farther north. And I knew vaguely that there was like a football team and it was cold. That was all I knew. And then as I started to, live here and meet people and become, involved with the university and the community, I started to realize, I know it's like its own whole thing. And somebody, I think it was one of my students actually in my first semester, said, you don't understand, Wisconsin is like a different country. It's like its own whole country. And I thought that really is true. She nailed it. And then she gave me some tips on how I could fit in my new country, which were like very accurate and also kind of hilarious. But I think experiencing that from a somewhat outsider's perspective makes me really appreciate Perry's conception of it and how he communicates it. And what I think he does particularly well is in creative nonfiction, what we might call like a braiding technique, where he brings together, these potentially horrifying accident scenes while also looking comedically at these small town characters, which he manages to do without it seem like he's mocking them or putting them down. It's more from this sort of loving perspective. And I think the other thing he does really well is tap into this sense of like blue collar intellectualism, blue collar intelligence that not everybody gets, because I think people tend to collapse like IQ with, degree status or something, which is completely false. And we miss all these other forms of intelligence and experience that I think he really shows us through his writing and his characterization, especially. Another Wisconsin writer I've gotten to know because of Rebecca Early's Nicholas Butler. And I'm probably going to butcher this line, but there's a line in a Nick Butler book that says something like, talking specifically about Wisconsin, that the only thing anybody cares about here is how kind you are and whether or not you're competent. And I think that Perry's writing really taps into that sort of blend of kindness and competence with this rural, somewhat depressing backdrop that also incorporates humor and just strikes me as authentic.
I love that quote. How kind you are and if you are competent.
Or how competent you are or whether or not you're kind. I can't even remember which book it was in. I think Shotgun Love Songs.
But that's really, I want to, we'll be getting to, I think, a little bit about like, is there like an essence of Wisconsin or Midwestern humor or like, these regional characteristics or characters we all try to like figure out or define. And so I love the way that you're seeing that in Perry and what he's doing with that. That's awesome. Okay, so I'm going to go to Chuck next, and then I'll let Ryan wrap this all up on this question. So the pleasures of Michael Perry to Chuck.
Oh, wow, I have there's a lot to respond to. I'll stick to the pleasures though. I think in picking this up as a piece of fiction, so I'm someone who loves Faulkner, and Faulkner is what I would consider a rural writer. That's really what he focuses on. He was born in New Albany, Mississippi, which is not a booming metropolis by any means. But you read his work and it really is the life of the mind in Faulkner. It's you can just get lost. It's very philosophical and abstract, and I think lovely for those reasons. Conversely, when I was an undergraduate, I was reading an anthology in a literature course, English Lit, and they had like Newton in there and Darwin. And I'm just like, these aren't literary writers. What the heck is this? And so we read Newton, and to me, that one of the pleasures of reading Michael Perry is like how Newtonian this world is. It's really Newtonian physics, and thinking of the opening chapter or story, or however we want to call it, that this world really does work on things go this fast and the road turns at this angle. And if you go too fast here, you're going to smash into this thing. And that is going to do exactly this to your body. And blood is going to move from here to here. And then the deus ex machina of the helicopter is going to show up again. and pick people up and fly them off to a place where other human beings know all the physical things about the body. You know, cars crashing into storefronts and all that kind of stuff is like getting to the title of the panel and about faith is that, you know, to me, he expresses that if you make the world that way of like physical forces crashing into each other, you know, the way force and movement works, that you can have faith in that world because it's predictable that something connects with something else and it moves away from it at the same force that it received. And there's something really comforting about a Newtonian world that way, especially in a small town like this. I'm touched that Noah added 4 people to the population. I thought that was really generous that you aspired to growth in that type of area, which is Newtonian in its own right. But you know, to me, I mean, I read a lot. I read just a ton of different kinds of stuff where you're just in the mind and philosophy, and I just appreciated being connected to the pleasure of physical things, and, you know, anchored in a world that had mass and weight and force and acceleration and that kind of stuff.
I don't even know how to follow that. That was like a really genius interpretation. That was really great. And that, you know, that's a view that hadn't even occurred to me, but like that, yes, if you work with bodies, if you work with, you know, this is how you control a scene. This is what is, you know, these are the procedures. These are the operations that we do. There is that routine, that predictability, the same way Stanislaw is going to go always milk those cows at that time of day. There's this routine predictability to it that is a pleasure, right? And a comfort, I would think, to some degree that there's, and one of the essays that I just read from this collection of Population 485 right before we got on screen was called Death. And it was like, it's like this is, you know, and I didn't share it out with the panelists because I was like, well, you know, I think we get this other, you know, but it is very much about like, the first line is, I can turn you into a corpse. And it's, I can predict, I've seen bodies in so many different ways. I don't like to do this, but I have the ability to envision your body going through death in all the ways I've seen death. And it's, I mean, but it's not, go ahead, sorry.
Well, one thing that he does that, so I'm sort of mildly famous for mispronouncing things for long portions of my life. And so if the phrase walking a tightrope, I used to pronounce that as type rope for most of my life, TYPE. And I think that's what Michael Perry is doing, actually, is that Newtonian impulse. He doesn't want to judge people. He's very careful to not want to label them or judge them in a way, you know, especially in our post-hillbilly elegy world, and how a book like this would fit into that. But it's like that type of focus on the physical things that you were just describing too. It eliminates judgment. It's not, what were you doing? How did this accident happen? It's, they were going this fast at this point, and the body met this other body, and here we are.
It's really well put. All right, we're going to return to that point in a minute. Ryan, pleasures, please.
Yeah, well, I should preface this by saying that I think I may have done the homework incorrectly at times for this. And it's not that I didn't try. I did. In fact, I think the issue is that I read the wrong things or listened to the wrong things as I was prepping this. So first I read Truck, which were not good. And then I downloaded Population 485, and but then as I was listening to it, discovered that it also had sections from Off Main Street. So I think most of what however, what I would say is consistent with what a lot of people have said here. I am an optimist who kind of knows in their heart of heart they should be a pessimist. And Chuck is shaking his head because he knows that, like, I keep gravitating towards hope throughout my life at times when my brain tells me there's no hope, right? That we should know this. And I think, so all of that is to say, I am a sucker for stories of people finding their way. And I love stories about people who find their passion, discover something they love, discover something they're good at, connect with other people that it's good that they connected with. And so all of this is to circle around to the fact that there is a story, I believe, in Off Main Street but I don't actually know which one it is, in where he talks about how he discovered writing as someone who was, I think, originally planning on studying nursing. And it is such a beautifully crafted essay, and it was, because I will admit that in the beginning of listening to this, I didn't necessarily feel the same connection that a lot of other people on this panel are feeling. But that story was one that really, really shifted my thinking about him and about the work. And it was a really powerful moment of someone who is like sort of going a direction that they thought they wanted to go, and then discovering something else that they didn't necessarily anticipate loving. And it spoke to me for personal reasons. It spoke to me for professional reasons as a college professor. There's just a lot about it that I really, really loved. So for me, that was the pleasure.
Ryan, you don't have a problem with the homework. You just earned a ton of extra credit, I think, by doing all of that stuff. Did you, when you said you downloaded, are you doing the audiobook? Is that what you did of?
Yes. So
okay.
I got the idea from Anne, actually. I realized I'm actually not an audiobook person typically. This was my first in a very long time. And apparently I'm not very good at it because I listened to the wrong thing, but
that's how it's packaged.
Yes.
I say this out of recognition because I'm a person who does much better with audio lately than I do on the page for all kinds of reasons. I don't know why. There was a pleasure in listening to Michael Perry, but the way they package that book is really deceiving because there's all this stuff at the front that's not that. And I was like, no. And I figured it out at some point, which is good stuff. I don't mean to be like, there's all this garbage in the front that's like his other collection. Like, who wants that? But Ryan, what I'm drawn to in the way that you're talking about this is there seems to be two things going on in his writing. And one is there is the story of, or there is the person who is the troubadour or the storyteller of the town. Here are all the characters. Let me tell you the story of New Auburn and all the things in it. And then what you are drawn to in particular also about this is that second role he's playing, which is someone finding his way. And I mean, that is like meeting your neighbors one siren at a time, which implies there is a whole like trajectory. There's an arc. Like, I'm going to tell you about this town from each call that I go on, and there's a journey to be taken here. So I guess a question that I have, I think I'm going to throw it out to everyone. Originally, I was going to throw this out to Chuck, but I think I'm just going to throw this, just to start, to everyone is kind of like how he manages to do what he's doing. So Perry as a figure in his own work, particularly the stuff that many of us read or listened to, is a figure of like, he's a chronicler, but that means he has to have this position that's sort of higher than everyone. And he makes references to, like, he clearly is educated. Like, he talks about what is irony, or like he's defining stuff for us. So in one way, that position of the chronicler, I think that's what I'm interested in talking about. He's got to be above to some degree because he's the one pulling this together and organizing it and making into this book. But like, how does he do that position? Does he do it well in that, even on a craft level, how does he do this so that he's not being a carnival barker? Like, oh, look at Tricky and look at these freaks over here. My God, my town is filled with these wild people. Or a tour guide, which seems a little bit not quite what he's doing, but also, or a compatriot. So this is kind of for everyone who'd like to weigh in on it, however you'd like to weigh in on it. We don't have to go all the way around, but how does he position himself? How does he maintain that position? And what is that position? How does he not make us look like we're paying to go see some spectacle or a parade of oh, it's rural. Here's the parade float of rural Wisconsin. So how does Michael Perry's position as a storyteller work? How does he do this? Anyone want to try that? Go ahead, Jenny.
I think so. I have a love-hate relationship with memoir type writing. Like, for years, it was all I wanted to read. It was all I wanted to write. Lately, half the time I feel like it's just too much navel gazing, and I'm going back to fiction or journalism or straight humor or whatever. I think that if you're going to write this kind of prose, you have to, some of it reads too much like the writer is an outsider, like compared to everybody else. And some of it reads too much like the writer is an insider who can't get over the self. And I think what he does somehow is hit that perfect sweet spot right in between where he's both insider and outsider. I don't see most of his writing as being about him. It seems like it's about something bigger. It's about the town or about the family or whatever, but he also doesn't try to negate his own positioning in it, because if he did that, then he loses credibility and authority. He's super self-deprecating, which helps. He recognizes his own complicity in a lot of problems. He also doesn't try to, like Rebecca, you were just saying, you know, he's clearly extremely educated, extremely articulate. He doesn't try to deny that, but he also doesn't allow it to really give him too much of an advantage in terms of observational ability. It gives him an advantage in how he articulates that observation, but not really in his sort of active lived position within the community. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yep. Others?
Yeah, I guess I'll just echo what Jenny said about that. And for me, you know, one of the ways he does that, and he kind of maintains both that insider outsider positioning and his persona, is that he says, yes, I'm a thinker, right? I write books all day, but I'm also a doer, right? And so he doesn't, in our minds and in our culture, those things are often bifurcated, right? You know, like intellectual labor is distinct from this other thing, right? And he kind of, and I think Jenny, you said that earlier, is that that's one of the democratic things about his writing, is that he's leveling intelligences, right? He does why can't I think of his name? Mike, the one who writes about different kinds of intelligence, blue collar intelligence.
Mike Rose.
Yeah, it resonates with that, right? And so I think in that sense, he's really there's something very Whitmanian about him, and that there's a love and there's a gentleness and there's a like a real authentic investment in humanity and democratizing people, right? In this way, and you know, but at the same time, you know, he's intellectual and he appreciates that, but he's also, you know, saying we need doers too, right? And I'm a doer, and this is how I can be a part of this common humanity, is by being a doer, right? You know, and that's just as important, right? And so that, I think that's what's so cool about him, right? He occupies all these different positions and appreciates different ways of being and ways of thinking and being intelligent.
Absolutely. Like, yeah. And he's also, I think, doesn't claim authority like he could. Like, you know, I'm the smart guy coming back and I can tell you how it is. I mean, there was something in his keynote, I think, where he was talking about, you know, I have this experience with machines, or like as a doer, Anne, as you're kind of talking about, but talking about sort of what Jenny's comment and even Noah's about humility early on. He's like, yeah, but I wasn't good at it, or people had to go get me to like tell me it was my turn to go do the things, because I would opt out if I could, right? So I'm not a hero in that particular doer way that I'm also valorizing at the same time. Other folks on his position, if you want to talk about it.
Sorry,
Chuck.
So I just building off what's been said so far, like his positioning, like in and out of that world, and to me, like all of that is a trope. Like I don't think that's real. And one of my experiences with this book is, and I think this is really interesting, and a credit to him, I find him to be incredibly disingenuous, but for good reasons. And I guess I'll get to that. Like he, you know, back to your question about his position, like, I mean, this is well anchored in literary tradition of the guide, like Dante and Virgil, walking through, that world, or like Tiresias or Prufrock, and who is the person that's going to guide you through this world. And there's no more well-worn trope right now, or if I could use a rural metaphor, like overplanted fallow field, than we must take you to the rural place to see these people. They must be explained to you. How could you possibly know what happens in such places? And if you need a reference, see the New York Times. So it, but what's really, I like his comments about how, well, I'm the poet in this town. went to a poetry reading. I'm weird, as if that's only really weird in rural areas. Like, it's actually really weird in urban areas too, but by greater orders of magnitude. And I know this by experience, like, because I'm a poet who lives in a city, or have lived in cities, like, I'm no more accepted or no less weird than any of those things. And the attendants at my readings can confirm that. And it's like and it's worth remembering that, like, our tradition literary is like anchored in the rural. Like, I just want to, like, William Wordsworth, I just want to say where he was born, because it's a great place. Cockermouth, Cumberland, right? Like, Dickinson, Amherst, Massachusetts. Twain was born in Florida, Missouri. I didn't even know there was a Florida in Missouri. Whitman in Western Hills, New York. Like, I mean, Mark Twain, right? Like, the rural is central. It's like the American literary experience, but somehow we present it as the people in the city and the urban centers must not be understood because they're there, and therefore it's all obvious and easy, and it's not even close. But like, in the hands of a lesser writer, I think it could become condescending. But what I find really brilliant about what he does in using that trope, where he just kind of flickers back and forth, is that it, connecting to hope, which was in the title of the panel, is that he presents people anew. Like, he calls all this attention to himself just in order to make people be seen with fresh eyes, and I don't know, when I'm thinking about hope, to me, that's a hopeful thing, that we could all do something in the world where people might just look at us and pay attention for a little while and have something to say about it. And I really appreciate that. I think he goes through a lot of gymnastics to get us there, but the heart that gets him there is really good. And that's what I'll say about that.
Perry does say, and I'll get to know in 2 seconds. I saw you want to talk about this. Perry did say, I think, in that keynote for this program for Door County Reads, that he needed to see something both with his eyes and his heart, right? And so I think there is, like we're talking about, the way he's kind of able to do all of these gymnastics or work with these what can be contradictions or seen as contradictions. He's doing both, right? And so that heart is shining. It's coming through. Noah, what did you want to say?
Well, especially after just listening to what Chuck said, I'm wondering if what I'm about to say is really more about me than it is about Michael Perry. One of the things that attracts me to that man is that he has a clear sense of wanderlust, and which is one way to explain like why he's inhabited all of these different professions and been in all these different places. He's searching for something. And maybe like the catalyst for leaving New Auburn in the first place is because it's a town of 485 people and it was just too small to contain him at that time. And so as a young man, he leaves this place and he goes out into the world and he's going from one thing to the other, accumulating experience, which is sort of parallel to my experience as well. I've had like 5,500 different jobs that run the gamut from, being a Photoshop editor all the way to being an electrician and doing all these things while at night I was doing my theater artist, my actual career, and I'm putting actual career in quotes because all of those jobs that I had were fodder for what I was doing at night as a theater artist, to giving me the experience I needed to be able to speak intelligently about how I'm moving through life. It's my personal journey. And in this, and I may be reading more into it than there is, but for me, Michael Perry comes back to New Auburn because he found in his travels that the thing he needed was actually back at the beginning, which goes back to the idea of one of the topics of this discussion, at least from the material, is love of place.
Mm-hmm.
That New Auburn ends up being his anchor, and that when he's writing these stories about these people, it's like he's not really writing about them, he's writing about himself and explaining to us through their experiences why he came back to this place,
Mhm.
explaining why he loves it. And I'll just wrap up by saying that the reason that my wife and I are not in Chicago anymore, and we're here in Green Bay, and it didn't have to be Green Bay, it could have been anywhere, is because my roots are in small towns, and I wanted to go back to my roots. Because now I've done this other thing, and I've been to other countries, and I've traveled and been to mountains and deserts and everything in between. And now I find that my comfort is in a smaller community, which is absolutely rich with all the same people that I met out there, you know?
Yeah. That was great. Ryan, do you want to weigh in on this, or do you want me to give you something different?
No, which I can't add to all that brilliance. So let's...
Like, but I'm going to talk about truck.
Yeah.
But let me tell you what you don't know. I think I'm gonna start to swerve a little bit, because I love what you guys are saying, but it also hits me that like there's this element of interpretation or like empathy that he's adding of his position that I think this will get us into the next part of what I want us to talk about. So there's this part in Tricky, which is from this sorry, you can't see my screen. Hello, Population 485. There's a chapter called Tricky, and in it, there's this calamitous, like a car runs into a laundromat, and Perry and his crew are on the scene. But he also talks before, like around that, in the beginning of this, about New Auburn and where it gets its name from. And he's doing some cool things with perspective. This is just a side note that while everyone was talking, I realized that he actually takes aerial views, like he'll go up on high as he's setting a scene for something, or, you know, he'll come from below and see a helicopter. Like he's doing a lot with like sort of point of view and perspective in this. So anyway, we're going through New Auburn, and then he has next to him or like a neighbor in a yard just outside town, a spray painted piece of frayed plywood leads against a tree. It reads Trans Am's 2 for 2,000. It has been there for 2 years, right? And so then he leads into who these people are. And this kind of gets to what the panel's about, and maybe takes us into another direction about like our mental health as we read this, or how we feel as readers. So he watches the old man and his son tinkering on the speedboat out, you know, in this yard. They pop the cowling, poke around with wrenches, stare, cuss. The old man stands inside the hull, and so they're working on stuff. The man and his son talk as they work, and if I'm doing dishes at the sink, I catch fragments through the screen, but is their persistence and glances towards the road that speaks most clearly. And the message is, life is a box of shit, but by God, we've got a speedboat, and one of these days, we'll get that son of a tetcher running, and we'll go out some Sunday fucking afternoon, and we'll blow all them Illinois tourist bastards right out of the water. They keep working, right? So what I love about that is so much, right? The way that it's like, you know, by God, we got a speedboat, right? They're like in the middle of a yard working on a speedboat. And also what a symbol kind of like hope that really is. Like, by God, we're going to do this. But also there's a regionality to it. Those Illinois, I'm sorry, Noah, the people who are from Chicago, that's about you. You've converted, but like we're gonna blow them out of the water. Like this makes us more of who we are, because those city folk don't get us. So I'm gonna pitch this to Ryan. Ryan, when I read that, there's so much richness there about. It's funny. It's a funny way it captures what's going on. He's in their head. Like, how can you tell me a little bit more about how that kind of writing, or maybe that moment or whatever, kind of helps, like what it does to us as readers in our human bodies and our emotions, and how this maybe makes us feel good, or what they're saying makes us feel good.
Yeah, and it's funny because I actually this morning went on sort of a deep dive into the research on reading and mental health, and sort of what we know. And one of the interesting things is that there's almost no research. In fact, I would just go so far as to say there really is no research out there on reading nonfiction versus reading fiction. That there's really no data out there. And part of that, I wonder if there's because we don't actually see much of a difference as far as what the mental health benefits are. That well-crafted fiction can have the same benefits as nonfiction. But I do think, I mean, you've hit, and we've used this word a couple times today, but that it's, to me, it's so much of it is about empathy enhancement. And, you know, I mean, reading in general has all sorts of benefits, right? Cognitive benefits, it helps your memory, it improves your vocabulary, it does all sorts of things, it makes people feel good, it helps people de-stress, et cetera, et cetera. But the piece about empathy enhancement is something that I'm particularly drawn to, because we don't necessarily think about that in terms of mental health, or I should say in terms of mental illness, but I would argue we should, because the opposite of empathy, I might call self-centeredness or narcissism, or a host of things that I think are essentially, we consider to be pathological. And so this idea that improving people's capacity for empathy, I see that as a way of improving their capacity for mental health and mental wellness. That empathy is a psychological strength that prevents us from developing all sorts of other sorts of mental health problems.
Excellent. Other folks on what, maybe you're not a trained psychologist, right? But maybe you know, like when you read something like that, I mean, for me, like what Ryan's saying, I think it's interesting that he's actually even modeling empathy, like that he's, as a writer, he does this all over the place. Like he's imagining in the first essay from this first chapter from Population 485, he's imagining what it's like to be that girl in the accident alone when all this beauty around her and she's just utterly alone. And we're not there yet. He's using also suspense and all these other storytelling things to keep us interested in like her plight. But in the end, she's just by herself. And then these two guys that might be annoying next door, like, Chuck and I live next door to some people who love engines a lot, or used to a lot more. And this kind of enters and you're like, what is going on over there? But he instead of being like, these people, he's like, oh, he understands what this means to them, this boat getting it going. And it's funny, but it's also like he gets it and he's showing you how to understand it. Anyone else want to comment on kind of like what this sort of does for us, or how it leads to our happiness, well-being, and optimism?
I think, I just to kind of build on Ryan's idea of empathy and empathy building. And I think like, even if it's not empathy, I'm thinking about like what he talked about in his keynote. He talked about different kinds of laughs, right? He said, I know when I'm with Midwesterners and it's the laugh of recognition, and for other folks, it's the laugh of what? Like, what is that? But everyone's laughing, right? So what is that like? What does the laughter have in common? It's maybe it's empathy, or maybe it's empathy for the people who are like the fear, or maybe that's a way of othering, or another form of flattening the Midwest. I don't know, but it doesn't seem to be that way, right? So like when I in the research I've done on comedy and kind of like the role of the comedian in establishing a community, right, with the audience, a sense of community, it has a lot to do with seeing yourself, right? It's about verisimilitude in some ways, right? When you can get someone to laugh at observational humor, right? Some kind of observation, a lot of it has to do with recognition. and feeling seen also, especially if you're a marginalized community, right? Or occupy a marginal position, right? It's like, wow, you know, someone saw me, or someone recognized my existence, or you know, is articulating something about my experience that I don't have the power to articulate. I don't have the platform to articulate. And so that's empowering, right, for an audience member, right? So I think that to me is part of the audience writer relationship here, even though it's not uniform, right? It depends on, you know, where you're positioned and where you live and what your experiences are. But I think it can be very positive emotionally or psychologically in that regard.
Really well put. Go ahead, Chuck.
To the point of empathy, I was thinking about, I don't know, like if you know Joseph Campbell, or like literary types and tropes, like the sheriff, the hero, the wanderer, the, you know, the healer, the blind prophet, all of those things. And so in reading Michael Perry, I found myself engaging with a category, and I promise this connects to empathy, engaging with a category that I've not really thought about as a literary type, which is that of the volunteer. And being a volunteer firefighter is really a lot different than being part of an institution where the purpose of that position is obligation and you're receiving payment for that. And I don't know, there was something endearing about the guide of this book also being a volunteer, and what that meant for empathy in terms of, like, I'm involved in some volunteer things right now that, because I'm trying to understand people better, like I want more empathy. And maybe that's a narcissistic way to put it. Maybe those two things are inseparable, that it's really, volunteering is really about me, I swear. But that there's something that I just find that that's a real endearing part of this, to create a literary type that is the volunteer who is there out of will and genuine concern and openness to empathy. And just hearing both Anne and Ryan talk about that just made me think of that.
I think it's a great new trope to explore about that, you know, the volunteer. And again, this gets back to Anne's point of kind of being a doer and a thinker at the same time, like, and that this isn't my job. This is like a call, not quite a calling. I don't want to like elevate it up to that kind of a thing, but it's something. And he does say, in terms of that community building and seeing ourselves that people have been talking about, you know, these are our people. Like volunteering in a small town, like, you know, you're going to run into the person whose grandmother's body you just took out of a house, and they're coming from the funeral, and here you are maybe trying to do raffle tickets or whatever you're doing, and you're going to run into them again. So it is that positioning that he's doing that allows for all that empathy. Part of the, as we head down towards the last maybe 5 minutes of this panel, certainly if anyone has questions, they can pose them in the chat and I can ask them. But barring that, you know, part of the pleasure of Perry, and I think, you know, we've all kind of gotten to this, is the humor. And yet we haven't really sort of talked about humor or Midwestern humor. So one of the things, of course, I love about that little section, and, you know, is that, of course, he's like, screw Illinois, and, you know, and by God, you know, we got the thing that I read about the people repairing the boat. So I guess I'm asking this generally, not necessarily about Perry. Is there such a thing as Midwestern humor? And can you talk a little bit? And also I will acknowledge that one of the ways to make something 100% unfunny is to talk about why it's funny. I've done this before in classes called the literature of laughter, which were not funny at all, but the books were. So I wonder if you have any like examples of Midwestern humor, what you think it is, or a really quintessential like appropriate for 10:30 or 11:30 in the morning Midwestern joke. I'm looking at you, Ryan, for appropriateness. No. I know, you're like, that goes most of my material. So is there such a thing as a Midwestern sense of humor? What is Midwestern humor? Or do you like a quintessentially Midwestern joke that we'd like to kind of end the panel on? Anyone want to try this? Go ahead, Noah.
I don't have a joke, but I do want to address the idea of why you can assign different kinds of humor to the region that it comes from. So for speaking specifically about Midwestern humor, I think it's a function of who we are as a community, as a society, whether we're talking about Wisconsinites, people from Illinois, Minnesota, Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, is that part of it is weather. And Michael Perry himself comments on it, how, you know, we complain about the heat of the summers and then love the fish fries in the winter, right? It also ties into how we feel about each other. So some of Midwestern humor or Southwestern humor or California or New York or wherever you happen to live is tied into it's like a series of inside jokes that only people from, let's say, the Midwest understand, and leads to the popularity of a comic like Charlie Barron's, right? He is the Wisconsin stand-up comic. That is what he is making his career on. And the reason he's so successful, at least in this region, is because he's doing something that is recognizable to the people that he is emulating. And one thing I wanted to say, actually, based on when I was listening to Em, is the idea of how satire is a two-way street. Because satire can be cruel. And it can also be compassionate. But that takes all the responsibility off of the people being satirized, to be humble and to have the humility to laugh at themselves. And, you know, I'll just share this one thing. This is about the Wisconsin idiolect, which is a specific dialect, is when Kelly, my wife Kelly and I first moved here, we went to see the lights at the botanical garden, and we were on the horse-drawn cart going along the path and looking at the lights, and there were a whole bunch of people on the cart with us, and there was a lit dragon. And so this lady sitting right next to me says to her companion, "Ooh, look at the dragon." And I mean, everybody knows like yeah, we're gonna go into the fish fry, you know, that kind of thing. But that's like stereotypical. But dragon was our first, and we laughed our asses off, but not, I want to be very clear, we were not laughing at that lady because her joy was contagious, frankly. It was more like, this is so different, you know? And so you apologize to me for the idea of, because people from Wisconsin call people from Illinois fibs, and we'll let people guess at what the F part of that is. And you can look at it one way and say, this is good-natured cross state line ribbing, you know, cheeseheads and fibs. And if you are a fib and you understand why they're making, you know, that there are people who sort of abuse whatever the vacation home thing, whatever. I'm not very well versed in that, but I understand that that's part of where that comes from, is if you understand that it's good-natured, then you take it that way. Because if you have humility, then you're open to the satire, and the satire, as long as it comes from a good place, is compassionate, and that's a healthy place for us to live. And just to wrap this up, I'm sorry, I'm sort of droning on, but one thing that was really important to me was the idea of how Michael Perry describes these people in satirical yet compassionate ways. And they either take it that way or they don't, but we are living in times where people are not humble. Humility is actually quite rare now. We've divided ourselves along ideological lines and for a variety of reasons. So something like this work of nonfiction, technically, right? Mm-hmm. It's nonfiction. Comes at such a good time to help remind us that we are imperfect. And this is very much Midwestern humor. And it's very recognizable to those of us who live in the Midwest, whereas it would not be as recognizable to someone in the South or again, in the Pacific Northwest. It is specific to us.
like the way that you put that. Other folks, as we wrap down, want to talk, tell a quintessential Midwestern joke?
I don't have a joke, but I will tell you, there is a genre of, so a year ago, I probably would not have been able to recognize Midwestern humor as distinct, but there is a genre on TikTok of people, I knew I wasn't gonna be able to get through an hour-long talk without mentioning TikTok, by the way.
You almost made it.
So there's a whole genre of jokes there about Midwesterners, and I mean, it's a lot of what Noah just pointed out. It's the language, it's the accent, it's the niceness, it's things like that that is really great, and really funny, but you'll see it all over. And of course I get fed that because I'm in the Midwest, but it feels very much stuff that I can connect with because I recognize it, because I see the truth there. I see that it's, to use, that it's I guess punching at ourselves that way, in a way that is sensitive and funny.
Mhm.
Wonderful. Chuck, did you want to say anything?
Oh, again, I'm just going to say what everybody else said in terms of this is not a joke, but that a lot of Midwestern humor is really built on simplicity, like humble. Oh, we're just the simple people here. And I've now lived the majority of my life in the Midwest, and although I was born on the East Coast. And, one of the things that I really love about this is, like, we live in this world of hyper specialization. So again, I'm thinking of the difference between a firefighter and a volunteer firefighter, not that volunteers are untrained, but that things that seem hyper specialized are actually within our reach. And I hear Michael Perry saying, you too can have a hose and squirt water on things that are hot, right? Like,
Yeah.
you too can squirt water on a flame and it will go out. It's amazing. You don't even need to be in a union or go through 1,000 hours of training to do that, right? And I think there's something funny and humble but genuine about, like, trying to just look at something in its most simple, again, kind of Newtonian terms. Fire, put water on it. It's amazingly effective. I find that to be funny.
Awesome. Anne or Jenny, any jokes for us, or anything that you want to talk about?
I have a joke.
Essentially, you have one?
Yeah. I don't know that it's
okay.
I don't know that it's Midwestern content, but I would say it's Midwestern tone. Okay, so what is green and fuzzy and will kill you if it falls out of a tree on you?
I don't know. Tell us.
Any takers? A pool table.
Now that's Newtonian right there. I like that. I was going to try to do a knock-knock joke, but it wasn't going to work. So I'm glad that you did that instead.
I like that. Yeah.
I like that. And it's a perfect joke. And I think it sums up, kind of like, yeah, of course, that's going to happen. Why think bigger than that, right? All right. Anne, did you want to add anything, or should we end on that joke?
I'm good. I can't top that.
All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for their participation. I want to thank you for your deep thoughts and for helping me unpack the mystery of why it is that we feel good when we read Michael Perry. I'm glad that I consulted the smartest people I know to help me on this. And thank you so much for being a part of this, all the folks that attended and that will attend via the magic of technology and film and so forth. I'm going to hand it back over to Tina, who's going to conclude us. And thanks so much for coming.
Thank you, Rebecca. And panelists for the interesting and thoughtful session today. Really liked it. Be sure to join us for the remaining Door County Reads Festival 2022 events. Later today at 2 p.m., the Griffin String Quartet will be performing online. So please join us for that. And our very last event is on Monday, February 14th. There's a book discussion where they will be discussing Michael Perry's books or any other Wisconsin author, because Wisconsin authors was also our theme for Door County Reads Festival 2022. That will be at 7 p.m. and it is also online. So go to the doorcountyreads.org calendar for links and codes to access our remaining events. And if you missed events that have already happened, please watch the earlier programs online at doorcountyreads.org and leave us some feedback by filling out the online evaluation form. We would appreciate that. Thank you for joining us today and have a great rest of your day.